Muted if she, okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Saskatchewan Festival of Words. This afternoon, we're going to have a very interesting panel for you, Defying Genre. My name is Lindsay Morhart. I am the Vice Principal of St. Gabriel's School in Regina, Saskatchewan. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that the Festival of Words takes place and is broadcasting from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and all over, as you can see today, located on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory. The original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We feel it is important for us to acknowledge Treaty 4, but would like to point out that this is more than just a string of words or tokens used in reconciliation. So we invite everyone in attendance to consider how our acknowledgement of treaty land goes beyond the words themselves into something more mindful and meaningful, where we are active participants working to reconcile and rebuild relationships with Indigenous people whom we share treaty territories. We also prioritize equity and the mental and emotional safety of marginalized groups, people of color, LGBTQ+, and disabled people, etc., over the comfort of others. This is a safe space for everyone, and hate speech, insults, or rude remarks will not be tolerated. If you see something that concerns you, please contact one of the moderators of the festival directly. Also, this festival would not be possible without the support of our major funders, so we would like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada, as well as a long list of program funders that will be shown at the end of this event. If you're in a business that you know supports the festival, please be sure to thank them for their support. All right, I'm going to just do a introduction of each of our authors, and then they're each going to share a small reading with us that they've chosen, and then we'll move into a question and answer period. And if you have any questions, please put them in, and the Festival of Words team will pass them on to us for a little Q&A at the end. So I'm very excited first to introduce Dorothy Ellen Palmer, who is a writer, educator, accessibility consultant, and activist. In her memoir, Falling for Myself, she makes a passionate case for disability justice. This memoir was acclaimed by the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and Quill and Choir. Longlisted for the Relit Award, When Fenelon Falls features a disabled teen in the Woodstock Moonwalk Summer of 1969. Wiggins, Son of Sherlock, featuring a feminist disability lens, appeared this spring. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in both literary and disability journals. She is the winner of the 2020 Helen Henderson Award for Disability Journalism and the 2021 Cecil's Award for Writers Over 50. Dorothy serves on the Accessibility Advisory Committee for FOLD and the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. So welcome, Dorothy. Our next author I'd like to introduce is Hiromi Goto, is an immigrant from Japan who gratefully resides in Lekwungen territory. Some of her award-winning titles include Chorus of Mushrooms, The Kappa Child, and Half World. Her first graphic novel, Shadow Life, with artist Anne Zhu, was published just in the spring of 2021. She's published 3 novels for children and youth, a book of poetry, and a collection of short stories. Her grandmother was a formative influence in her life and writing. Her first novel, Chorus of Mushrooms, won the 1995 Commonwealth Writers' Prize, Best First Book, Canada and Caribbean region, and was the co-winner of the Canada-Japan Book Award. Her second adult novel, The Kappa Child, was awarded the 2001 James Tiptree Jr. Memorial Award. Her other honors include the Sunburst Award and the Carl Brandon Parallax Award. She is currently at work trying to decolonize her relationships to writing and to be a responsible guest on Indigenous lands. So welcome. And last but not least, Craid Davidson was born and grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, near Niagara Falls. He's published 4 previous books of literary fiction. And I have to admit, I took this from his website because it was, I loved it. He's written books about boxing and dogfights and zombies and werewolves and lunatic prison inmates and repo men and more boxing and vampires and sex addicts and grisly dismemberment by a crazed killer whale attack, but assures us this was not all in the same book. Rust and Bone, which was the inspiration for a Golden Globe nominated feature film of the same name, the Scotiabank Giller Prize nominated novel Cataract City, and the novel Saturday Night Ghost Club, which was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. His best-selling memoir, Precious Cargo, about his year spent driving a school bus for a group of wonderful kids, was a finalist for Canada Reads. And he lives in Toronto with his partner and children, and we did get to meet his littlest one here today. Pretty cute. So now, without further ado, I will invite Dorothy, if you would like to share your reading with us, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers and all the volunteers, and thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing the stage with me today. I'm going to read briefly from my memoir, Falling for Myself. My father raised stud guppies, beautiful male fish with fantails like monarch butterflies. He bagged them up and pimped them out to other guppy enthusiasts who paid a stud fee in hopes of their own handsome offspring. Father found his 12-tank calling thanks to me. He'd originally purchased neon tetras and angelfish, but I'd leaned too close, lost my balance, fallen into the tank, and pulled plants, pink gravel, fish, and the burbling little Diver Dan filter all onto the floor, where none survived. My mother spanked me. The next day, my father bought guppies. We all have one true gift to offer the world, and now you know mine. I fall down, repeatedly, spectacularly. Like the Pope, I'm forever kissing the ground. I trace my history by the scars on my body, by the times and places I've fallen. At birth, I fell from an unwilling womb into the arms of the Children's Aid. Falling far short of my adoptive mother's expectations, I spent my girlhood on my knees, apologizing for bloody leotards. When corrected to correct much of anything, I fell on crutches, in walking casts, and off my freshly cut feet. I fell at double dutch when my orthopedic Oxfords failed to jump, and at university when my unisex work boots stopped working. I married a good man in my 20s, and in my 30s, fell for a boy pretending to be one. In a heart-cracking moment as a new mom, I smacked the sidewalk with my firstborn in his snuggly. To the delight of my grade 10 drama class, I once fell right off the stage. I spent my 40s fighting not to need a crutch and my 50s resisting a walker. A faceplant into a moving streetcar changed my mind. At 63, my walker and I collided with a kilted hammer-throwing Highlander at the Fergus Scottish Festival. When he stepped over my face to help me up, it forever settled the pressing question of Scottish manhood and gave new meaning to the phrase, getting off scot-free. But if you're expecting an inspiring tale about the importance of getting back up, you'll be disappointed. Here's my truth. I'm a faller and will always be one. Falling makes me bloody furious, and it makes me furiously bloody proud. Now that I understand exactly that it's ableism that makes me fall, I know what I can and can't do about it. I'm learning to retrace my scarred history, to channel shame into solidarity, anger into analysis, denial into delight, and loss into love. After half a century of falling down, I'm falling up. I'm falling for myself. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dorothy. All right, Hiromi.
Hi. Thank you so much for that great excerpt, Dorothy. I'm going to be reading some script excerpts from my first graphic novel, Shadow Life. So because it's a graphic novel,
Neat.
it's all on panels and it's illustrated. But I'm going to read from the script because then you get that sense of the difference between the graphic novel as a finished form, and as you can imagine, and what it was like written in text form. So I'm jumping in at the start of chapter 2. It's about 76-year-old Kumiko, a widow who has taken off from supported housing that her well-meaning adult daughters has placed her in. And she's on the lam. So she's found herself a small little bachelor apartment in the gay part of the city. She likes to go to the swimming pool. Chapter 2. Close-up aerial view of Kumiko's face, eyes closed, water lapping her hair and cheeks, hair length just around jawline and nape of neck. Goggles are hanging, floating around her neck. White hair, face wrinkled, a little sun damaged, looks relaxed. She opens her eyes. See from her vantage point the large expanse of glass in the high ceiling, the reflection of the public swimming pool, the blueness of water, the old woman's floating body. She can't see outside because it's night, dark. View from outside the skylight looking in, pan further back. There's a silhouette of a rounded animal-like head, the size of a small cat, that's ambiguous, uncanny. It's looking down at the old woman. She's floated into the middle of the lane, her arms spread wide to the side, her legs in a slight V. She has a short and sturdy body, round tummy, floats well. She closes her eyes. Kumiko, thinking. It was so difficult to trust water again after Samuel's accident. 4 years before I understood it wasn't water's fault. Flashback, image of the back end of a car sinking into the water, the front end already submerged. Cutaway, Kumiko, still floating on water, opens her eyes. She glances at the clock on the wall, almost 10 p.m. She swings her legs down to bring torso upright to tread water slowly. Kumiko, thinking. It was just his time to leave this world. It's the living who struggle to accept death. Ducking between the lane markers, she slowly breaststrokes against the empty lanes to get to the little ladder at the side. Lifeguard number 1, woman, mid-40s, hosing down the deck, grins. Lifeguard number 1, you float like a cork. Kumiko ponders, pictures herself in tread water position, morphing into a cork, which morphs into a fat fur seal. Kumiko smiles, picks up swimming bag from hooks on wall, walks carefully towards women's changing room. Kumiko, Sedna has watched over me my entire life. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting to hear that that kind of aspect after kind of reading it with the pictures and the images. So thank you very much. Craig.
Okay, we're all set. My family is just downstairs, so I'm not quite sure. You might hear from them. They might be interesting background noise. I'm going to read just a little bit from, I guess, my most recent novel, which is Saturday Night Ghost Club. Came out a couple years ago. It's probably the closest thing I've ever written to something under my own name that straddles the line between genre and not genre. So I'm not quite sure this section gives that indication, but the book itself is probably that way. So this is just the beginning. Monsters. Most people believe the human brain is solid. They imagine a loaf of bread soaked in gelatin. You can hack off quivering slices, same as you would with Jell-O mold at a family picnic. But the truth is, the brain's texture is much more like toothpaste. Brain matter will squeeze through a keyhole. In cases of severe cranial swelling, surgeons use a drill. I myself prefer the RA2, a Korean model, to bore into the skull. If the swelling cannot be stopped, the living brain will project from a hole in an inverted funnel. This is called a coning, and it marks an end. Most people also believe the brain is gray. Its cells are called gray matter after all, and isn't that how the organ looks in horror flicks? A slaty walnut floating in a jar of formaldehyde in some mad scientist's lab. But a sheathed brain is bracingly pink. The tissue only turns gray once the cerebrospinal sac has been perforated and once the air hits it. When a brain cones, the tissue changes color. Traceries of ash spread through that bubblegum pink as a million thoughts flicker out and they die. People think neurosurgeons cut into brains with a scalpel, and that's just another myth. How can you carve toothpaste? An infant's brain matter is even less substantial than an adult's. It's really more like pancake batter. I operate with a sucker wand, a tool that is exactly as it sounds. And as I investigate the runnels of a patient's brain, it grips me that something unforgivingly solid, my wand, is moving through something ephemeral and dreamlike, a patient's memories. And though I work carefully and with a keen knowledge of the cerebral topography, my wand remains a beast blundering through fields of budding shoots. If I trample something critical, the patient may awaken lacking a vital memory. The one where they gazed into the sky as a child, wondering how a star might taste, settling on breathtaking wintergreen. The smell of their newborn daughter's scalp or that haunting tingle on their lips following their first kiss. I navigate the storerooms of a patient's consciousness, passing memories in their golden vaults, my wand clumsily bayoneting, it so often feels, the pink jelly that holds everything that patient is or ever will be. Hard as I try not to disturb the furniture, things happen. And I am forced to accept these tragic outcomes for the same reason that the patient on my table must accept their own lot, which is to say we are all only human, a condition of perpetual uncertainty and failure. The brain is the seat of memory, and memory is a tricky thing. At base level, memories are stories, and sometimes these stories we tell allow us to carry on. Sometimes stories are the best we can hope for, actually. They help us to simply get by while deeper levels of our consciousness slap bandages on wounds that hold the power to wreck us. So we tell ourselves that the people we love close their eyes and slip painlessly away from us, that our personal failures are the product of external forces rather than unfixable weaknesses. You tell yourself these stories long enough and you will discover that they have a magical way of becoming facts. But a secret can be hidden from everyone save its holder, and the brain is not only a storyteller, it is a truth-seeking organ. And if the stories we tell are no more than an overlay, the equivalent of 6 feet of clay covering a pool of toxic sludge, well, something's bound to bubble up. And the most awful truths will do so in the darkest hours of night when we're the most vulnerable. Now, if you bury these secrets so deep that you forget they ever happened, okay, maybe you beat the devil. But the truth is a bloodhound. That's something I can tell you to a certainty. The truth is that abandoned dog following you over sea and land, baying from barren cliff tops, never tiring and never quitting, forever pining after you. And the day will come when that dog is at your porch, scratching insistently at your door, forcing you to claim it once again.
Wow. I definitely could see the paddle that the description you were. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll get into this, and I don't know if you've had a chance to look over the questions. Feel free to, whoever wants to answer, and if someone sparks, if you go a different direction, great. I'll just kind of start off with, because the panel is called Defying Genre. The first kind of question, when I looked up genre, it said it came from a Latin word, which came from French, meaning genus, which is class or kind. So I want to ask you guys, how do you define genre?
Well, I'm happy to go first because I went first the first time.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say, Craig, I never thought I'd come to a literary panel and be afraid to ever brush my teeth again. So thank you. I thought a lot about what genre means, and I think there's an easy answer and a harder answer. The easier answer is it's a labeling system whereby readers find books and writers find readers. But I also think that under colonial capitalism, what it really is a way to put books in a hierarchy that makes it possible to make more money. So I'm not a big fan of the way genre creates a hierarchy that divides writers and that divides readers and makes some writers and some readers think they're better than others because the work they produce is supposedly higher on the hierarchy of genre. So I think that's a real issue, that when we talk about defying genre, it's that colonialism that we should be defying.
Hiromi or
Yeah.
Craid?
I have sort of similar thinking on the idea of genre. Like there's the side of thinking about it as the side from it as approaching idea of genre as an artist or a writer. So as something to think about creatively and intellectually and creatively. But there's also the other side where genre becomes a way to categorize, to be used in marketing, and also to organize a library. So there's there are different uses for the idea of genre. So I guess it depends on how it's being used and by whom. Yeah, that's what I'll just wait to add more to the conversation.
Craig, did you want to add anything?
I think my two astute panelists have said it better than I could anyways. I think when I've been asked a sort of a version of this question before, I always go back to when I was a kid, in a library. And I had no idea, to me, it was just a big room full of books. And I had no idea that they had been shelved according to genre or, nonfiction, in sort of the Dewey system back when I was a kid. But in any case, I basically thought they were just a bunch of books, and some of them appealed to me and my tastes and my aesthetic, and some of them were outside of my interest or outside of my ability to grasp. Certainly as you get older, and certainly as you enter becoming a writer yourself, you recognize, just as Dorothy and Hiromi said, there's a lot more going on to what defines the genre, and a lot of it is monetarily based, and the publishers have reasons why they sort of like to pigeonhole things. And I think readers, in some ways, I don't know, sometimes I think they can use sort of like a way of being led to the books that they like. And in some ways, that might be the reason why it's been categorized, but maybe it's been over-categorized and over-pigeonholed over time.
Well, and yeah, that's really interesting, because I just had a conversation this week with Angie Abdu kind of about this, because we were chatting about it, and she was talking about literary fiction versus genre fiction. And I didn't really understand what she was talking about. And I kind of said, like, slow down, I'm not sure, and I started doing a bit of research. Because for me personally, I just love reading. And so I find when I find a book, it's filling a purpose that I need at that time, whatever it is, right? I enjoy it. And so kind of by doing research, I read that some people argue that genre fiction is a way to kind of an escape, or, to leave your world, enter someone else's world, where literary fiction is kind of way of understanding the world. And there was kind of some snobbery based, like kind of what Dorothy alluded to, from both sides. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that argument, is kind of, people who are really into genre fiction will look down on literary fiction, and literary fiction might be looking down on genre fiction. So do you have any thoughts on that? Dorothy, do you want to start?
Okay. I've got no place for snobbery of any kind. And like I said, I think it feeds into, the way colonial capitalism wants us to think about writing, that it's competitive, that somebody has to win, that somebody has to be better than somebody else. And we have to vault these stars and make them rich and let everyone else languish in poverty. I mean, it's yes, it helps readers and writers find each other. I really do believe that when I said that. And I'm glad that organizers of bookstores and organizers of libraries do such a good job. But having said that, it's the competition behind all of that and the snobbery that sometimes comes from all of that I find really useless to me. I've written a thriller that I think is as interesting and exciting and as spellbinding as the literary fiction or the nonfiction I've written. And I just refuse to differentiate them hierarchically. They're different, but I don't think one is any better than the other.
Thank you.
My feeling is that literary fiction is a genre of fiction. So it's a particular type of fiction, which is a genre of fiction. So my thinking is like there are all kinds of genres of fiction, literary being one of them. I think, Dorothy's talked about snobbery. So it's the idea of there being high art and low art, which is again very hierarchical. Just like for me, it's more about what is the work doing? What's the text doing? So I don't think that literary fiction is more about our world than science fiction or a book of fantasy can be, because basically humans are writing all these stories, and in some way or form we're exploring or interrogating or puzzling out something of the world using language. So even the most speculative texts is some way reflecting our world, because we can't stand separate from our place in this world and our own humanities. So I think, science fiction and fantasy, detective fiction, ghost stories, all of it can and does speak about the realities and complexities of this world, but using a different kind of code. So, there are conventions of genre, which we haven't yet talked about. And again, it's a range of market forces, capitalism, but also sort of some underlining references that even writers will utilize. But lost my train of thought there. It was really good, but the train went over there.
Well, if it comes back, let us know.
Okay, so maybe I'll go around the whole loop. It's just like, oh, here it comes again. Yeah.
I really sympathize with you, because that happens to me more than I'd like to admit. Craig, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
Primarily for me, I suppose I grew up as a horror reader. That's sort of my one genre. I've taken cracks at others, but in terms of actually, writing books, outside of whatever I write under my own name, it would be horror. And again, to agree, I think, you can, a lot of some of the most interesting writing about the world, in a lot of ways, is coming out of sort of the genres now. Because you can tell an allegorical type of story that really comments very strongly on the world that we now live in, and not from sort of whatever a literary perspective. I mean, from obviously from a really talented writing perspective, and I consider the best of every genre as good as any whatever literature you would want to put forward. But you discover now editors are really interested in just, I think, in good stories and things that comment on the world that we live in, and finding interesting inroads, and more, and it's always been that way. Do you know what I mean? I really think the genre of books, be it really great fantasy, science fiction, horror, have found ways to comment on the world in which, at the time that they were written, and that continues to this day. So as much as literary fiction does, the genre fiction can comment and elucidate and make us more aware of the world we live in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when each one of you said something that I just completely agree with you, that I don't think there's any one thing. Like I said, when you go to read, you're going for a purpose, and I think you can take something from everything that you read, right? It's I don't think it matters what it is. One question we've talked about here, you've talked already, you guys have kind of alluded to it, the fact that genre it's all over the place, it's kind of fluid, and sometimes a story doesn't necessarily fit into one genre, or many pieces of work are not simply one or the other. So how does a reader, or how does an author for that matter, determine which genre their work is going to fit into. When you start, do you go in thinking this is what I'm going to do? Or some of you have kind of alluded to publishers and, you know, maybe making that call. Can you kind of speak to that?
The book I'm writing right now that I'm in the last stages of revising is called Kerfuffle. And it's not just a book about an improv troupe. It's an attempt to put improv on the page.
Okay.
And so there are no chapters, there are no conventional chapters. Someone just calls meanwhile and a scene jumps, and it can jump back into the improv show, or it can jump back into one of the characters' real lives. So it jumps all over. And I was very eager to do this, to break those conventions. And I was also very nervous to do that because I'd never seen it done before. And I've been an improv coach most of my teaching life for 30 years. And I really wanted to do it right to honor all the kids that I taught. And I was a little nervous about it eventually finding a publisher, but was glad it did. And I think that's probably more to the fact that it's set in the middle of the G20. And the protests of the G20 in 2010 in Toronto. It's a very political improv troupe. They're very police critical. So I think all of those things together, there's a little bit, obviously, of hard fact. There's a little bit of pure invention. There's something in between, which are all my years of experience. And fitting all of those things together creates sort of a new genre, but it was a necessary one to tell that story.
Mm-hmm. That sounds really interesting.
My approach, I guess part of my approach to whether or not I'm actively thinking about sort of genre conventions and genre expectations is whether or not I'm doing a pantster project or a plotter project. So I'm primarily a pantster. That means writing by the seat of my pants.
Okay, thank you.
So, I have I have a strong sense of character. I have a concept, a strong voice usually, and a major scene. And then there's enough there. I can feel it. Like it's like there's enough there that I know it's going to be a longer work. And then I just write, and I don't necessarily know where it's going to go. It could go all over the place. So when I'm doing that, I'm not thinking about genre. I think the only times that I think about genre in a sort of more specific way is if I want to pitch something to a publisher before having written it. Then you actually need to kind of state where you think it would be marketed.
Okay.
So then at that point, out of sort of marketing sales necessity, then I would, decide on what genre would be. Okay, this is going to be YA. This is going to be a book it's going to be fantasy YA, and then that's a genre.
Okay.
And then so you're writing a package, so you need to be able to do that. So those are some of the processes around that, the notion of genre for me.
Yeah, I think publishers do want to find places for writers to be, if only for readers to sort of find their way to them, or booksellers. I mean, there's an entire apparatus that I think sort of wants to confine writers into certain, but I mean, I think the thing that makes that interesting is that writers don't really necessarily always feel compelled to follow those kind of rubrics, and then you get books like, like Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. What is that exactly? Well, where does that belong genre-wise? A lot of Atwood's, her eco-fiction, Matadum, that trilogy, where does that belong exactly? I say it doesn't really belong anywhere. It belongs as a really good trilogy. Or David Mitchell, the British writer. I I have no idea where you would pigeonhole him, and I don't think he writes in order to avoid being pigeonholed. I just think the work that he does just resists that kind of ability to sort of say, okay, well, you know, he's a horror writer, or he's a literary writer, or he's writing about, you know, sort of far future civilizations. And ultimately, he finds his readership, and people find their way to his books for the reasons that, you know, they find their way to St. John Mandel's, and obviously to Atwood's as well. So, you know, there are some of us whose work sort of very easily fits into a genre. But there are many, many writers who I don't think they're resisting it in any kind of active way. They just don't have the sort of writing that fits itself into any sort of easily pigeonholable position.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, I was thinking, Craig, you've written under a pseudonym, correct?
Yes.
So is that all typically one type of book, or like, would you classify all, under one genre?
Yeah, mine's pretty simple that way. You know, I mean, again, I said I grew up in the 80s, and you could walk down the street without getting hit in the back of the head by a Stephen King book at that point. Or, you know, Clive Barker, Anne Rice, you know, Dean Koontz.
Right.
So I grew up with those guys, and I always wanted to write specifically horror books, you know. But I mean, again, I look at the writers in that genre, and I look at them now from when I was, you know, a teenager reading them at the first time, and when I see them now, you know, Stephen King, I don't know if he gets maligned anymore. I sort of hope he doesn't. I feel like at this point, people should recognize just how fantastic he is. But, you know, that kind of back in the 80s and the 90s, and probably still to this day, there's a persistent feeling that it's, you know, these were the sort of books that you would find in the drugstore on the spinny rack.
Yeah.
And so they couldn't possibly be any good. But I think over time, not only his work, but lots of, I mean, Shirley Jackson, for example, like, have been completely reevaluated and reseen and understood for the sort of stories that they were telling, and how valuable they were to, you know, as a commentary on the lives that, you know, people were living at the time and what they were reading, they were written. So again, I cannot state that my stuff is that socially conscious or anything like that, but I would say simply that I put the same amount of effort and whatever craft I have, I put them into whether I'm writing a Nick Cutter book or whether I'm writing a Mike Manley. Well,
that's good. That leads me right into my next question, just talking about, you know, when you've written, I know, so you referred to it as a plotster or a pantster, which is new terms for me. So Dorothy and Craig, what do you see yourself as first? Are you a pantster or a plotster?
The answer to that is actually a little embarrassing for me. Because I spent 30 years of my life teaching kids every possible organizer for writing a short story under the sun. Right. Graphs and T-squares and you name it. I taught them how to do it.
The hamburger.
I never have used one of them ever in my whole life. I'm a complete pantser. I sit down and go, oh, what will I do today? I don't know. It's embarrassing that I kind of have taught that for so long. But I think I also tried in my classes to say, if none of these are useful, don't use them. You know, use what works for you. And then, you know, occasionally when I write an essay, I find myself sitting and using the old hamburger model to get a clear view of what I'm doing. But I never start with any kind of outline ever.
Wow, that's interesting. I love it. I'm a fellow teacher, so that of English as well, so that that resonates with me. What about you, Craig?
Same. I'm a pantser, probably. Or certainly in the early parts of my career, I was, and probably the problem with being a pantser is that you sometimes get yourself in really desperate problems, you know, and that's why pencils have erasers, and that's all true. But I guess I've become a bit more of an outliner as I've gone along, just to streamline the writing process. But in my heart, I'm a pantser.
Okay, I've been corrected. It's a plotter or a pantster. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I had plotster written down. I kind of like that too. It's got a little ring to it. It's got a little ring to it.
A gangster. A
plotter or a pantster. Okay. So here's a question for all three of you. So readers sometimes come to a type of genre or genre fiction with certain expectations of what they're going to read. So I'm curious, when you write, do you write to fulfill what you believe the writer wants? Do you write to disrupt them? What is it that what are your thoughts on that? How do you come to that?
It depends on what the project is. So I'm a genre hopper.
Okay, yeah.
So, I hop from a lot of different forms of writing. And again, depending on sort of the nature of the project, sometimes, I'll sort of follow sort of the sort of a structure that, repeats patterns of previous storytelling. And then other times, just really, really mix it up. So it's a combination of what that particular story or essay or poem is, the content. So the content working with or against form. So it just depends on the project itself.
Okay. Craid?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
No.
Dorothy.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I think the only time I really had a clear sense of audience expectation was in writing my Sherlock Holmes book. Because when you enter into that world and you're trying to write a pastiche, which is an original, could be a Holmes story, but with variations on the theme, you have to honor the hundreds of thousands of Holmes fans who know way more than you do and who will come after you with how smarter they are and how wrong you are. So it's incredibly important to fit into that world, having done your homework, having done your research, being clear about the expectations. And it was a childhood dream for me to do that. So I'm glad that I finally did it, but it was also way more exhausting than any of the other books that I've written.
Thank you.
For me personally, I think the question was, you try and break the mold or you try and fulfill audience expectations. My feeling now, I do my best with it, and I don't always succeed. But I really just want to have fun when I'm writing. You know what I mean? I know that sounds almost silly or gimmicky, but I think after doing it for as long as I have, if I'm not having fun, it really shows. You know what I mean? Like, I think the work itself, it's obvious. The books that I've really enjoyed myself writing, obviously you want to say something with your books as well to whatever degree you can. But in general, if I'm enjoying myself, the book tends to work. And so I'm not really worried about whether I'm fulfilling audience expectations or whether I'm bucking them. It's just a matter of my own enjoyment as I work my way through the novel, and that usually bears fruit in the way that the book feels fresh and vital in whatever way I can make it.
Excellent. Hiromi?
I wanted to add one more thing, is that the idea of audience expectation is it's important to ask who we think the audience is or who we've been taught the audience is. So in my case, having grown up in the 70s and the 80s in the school systems, all the stories I read were about white people. Straight white people were the mainstream normative subject. And so at that time, I thought that was normal, until I started to more critically engage with that representation and what it was doing socially and historically. And so, if I had been guided by sort of audience expectation based on that, then, I would never write myself into the center in so much that I would, want to write stories about straight white people because that's all I ever read. Right. So that was sort of like an audience expectation that I learned through the school system. So it's I think things are getting better now in education, in how we learn, how we are taught to read, because I don't mean just learning the alphabet and learning to read, but how to decode critically and socially what we are reading, who's written what, why. So I think those are really important considerations as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. And I would say, based on what I see in the school system, definitely a more wider representation than even when I went to school, elementary school, in the late 90s or early 90s. So it's fantastic. Thank you. I want to just zip back around to the very beginning when we were talking about how bookstores or libraries are organized, and kind of there's a question from the live stream here, but you just reminded me, in recent years, we've decided to genreify our libraries. So now, rather than going in and just going, to nonfiction, and now everything is put into different little genre categories, so that kids can just, if I want a mystery, I go here. And what are your kind of thoughts about that, like genreifying? Do you like that idea, or do you find that maybe kids might not branch out, or people for that matter, if they're in a bookstore, might not branch out into something that they wouldn't have read before?
I don't have a problem with it. I think it's a certain amount of it's a bit of a maze, and you want to just find your way to and people have their, I wouldn't say peculiarities, that's the wrong word. They have the things that they like. And I think if you've got a sort of an open mind and a sort of a keen interest, you'll wander to the other sections anyways, and you'll sort of find your way through and find your way to the books that have meaning to you, sort of a thing. But in terms of having been genreified, that's the way it wasn't before. This is something that just happened recently, you're saying?
Just within I can only speak for Regina Catholic School Division. This has only happened in the last 3 years where they've genreified the libraries. So it's quite new for many people here. So
I guess my only concern about that is I'm thinking way back 40 years ago in the early 1980s, when I taught a class of kids that were unfortunately labeled at the time reluctant readers. And they were, of course, all boys, and they were all 15 years old, and that's a problem in itself. And so one of the things, I actually got a budget to bring in some magazines. So I tried to bring in a diversity of magazines, although most of them, I admit, 40 years ago were what I thought a 15-year-old boy might be most interested in. And there was this enormous big football player who never read anything, who sat with his nose buried in one of the magazines, and at the end of the class came up to me and pointed at the article and said, "I read this whole thing, miss." And I looked at it. It was an article on ballet. I said to him, "Nick, why did you read that?" And he made sure all the other kids were gone. And he said, "My mom died right after I was born, and she was a ballerina."
Oh,
Isn't that lovely?
that is
And so that's the danger. If you're over stratify and genreify, Nick will never find that magazine.
right.
Yeah.
And that's what I thought kind of too, but I just wanted to know what you guys thought.
Yeah.
I think I see sort of both ends of it. I think it's kind of like a sort of a spectrum of goods and bads with the whole genreifying. I think it's important to have categories like LGBTQ, I think, particularly for younger readers, especially if they're questioning or wondering about their sexuality, and they want to read more about it. Then if LGBTQ wasn't a section in the library, it kind of hard to find, perhaps, if it was all blurred out and just say organized by last surname alphabetically of all authors, then that would just be a random, mix of all genres, I suppose. So I think, people need to find certain kinds of books for very important reasons. And so, I really see the value of that. On the other hand, the categories can also be used as a way to silo certain texts. Say, that's just the LGBTQ book, and it's not literary, it's not important or relevant to straight people or something, And I'm doing quote marks on that because I don't believe it's true. So then I think what I would like to see is the categories existing, but also moving books around so that they're not just in that section. You have an LGBTQ book. It's about, and it's, sexuality is important in it. It's in the LGBTQ section, but then it's also in the literary section. So it's in both places because it's also a literary book as well. So, that might be, what I'd like to see more mixing of what's inside. And yeah.
That's actually a really good idea. I don't know how my librarian would feel about going in there and being like, well, I think you should be moving this. You have to take all the stickers off the books and move.
No, just add like 3 stickers on it.
Okay, yes,
so have 3 copies, have 3 stickers of them, YA, LGBTQ, and I don't know, literary. And then they're in all 3 sections.
That's so smart. I'm going to make a note of that because I think that's a really interesting idea. I'm always trying to find ways, like, how can I engage kids when they come into this room, right? And especially after this year where they weren't allowed in our library to take out books, I think there's going to be a really big push. Like, kids are going to be excited to get back in there. And so I think that's a really great idea. Like, how can you steer them to somewhere? Well, maybe having the 3 tags on a book rather than just 1, right? That's excellent. Thank you. I do have a question in the chat here for Dorothy. The question is, the world of Sherlock Holmes has intrigued many readers. How does Wiggins, son of Sherlock, take the reader into the fictional world of Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, okay. I'll answer that briefly. Wiggins is an iconic character from the canon. He is one of the Baker Street Irregulars, one of the urchins that Holmes pays every once in a while for information. In my book, Wiggins is not only a Baker Street Irregular, he is also a she. She is the daughter of both Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler. And Irene is ferreting him out to work for Wiggins, to work for Sherlock, trying to expose Sherlock, because Irene knows his real background, where he grew up as a home child in Canada. So there's a secondary plot line where, of course, Sherlock knows all of this all along and is actually doing something else. So where it also breaks the convention is that Wiggins is disabled. And so she is terrible at being a boy, terrible at running, terrible at fighting, terrible at any of the sort of street things that she wants to try to do to pass herself off as a boy. And all of those things, Sherlock eventually finds a way to come to grips with, and admits that he knows that he is her father, and he knows that he is actually a she. So it plays with a lot of the conventions and breaking them, and finally brings disability into the Victorian world, where it should have been all along, because so many people in the Victorian world were disabled.
That was a really quick, well done. A question is from the live stream. Do you think categorizing books by genre is interesting because of how genre definition has changed over the years? Or do you think that defining books by genre does a disservice to the uniqueness of different works? And if you want to read that again, because it's a bit longer, you can just open up the chat and kind of reread that.
I think there are new terms being new terms of ways to categorize different kinds of writing. So I'm really interested in seeing those terms so that they're not, the way what we call things change over time. So, some terms that I've really appreciated in terms of writing is speculative fiction. For a while, people were talking about slipstream fiction. Not so much anymore. I really love that one, but I don't know, it's not as popular anymore. But I love that idea of speculative fiction because it's a very big umbrella, and a lot of work can fit under it. So I really like the idea that these terms can shift and new ones evolve.
Dorothy or Craig, did you want to add anything to that one? Nope. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one last question. And you've kind of all talked about it, how you've written in different genres, or I guess what would be, how would I phrase this? When you've written in a new genre, what is the biggest challenge, or was it really difficult, or was it easier than you thought it would be? Or is it really hard to wrap your brain around kind of shifting gears to something you've never done before?
I just wrote a kid's book, and I went into it, kind of naive and maybe a little arrogant. And I thought, oh, how hard can this be? It's only 700 words. All my other books are, a lot longer than that. And it really brought me to my knees to realize that this is a very, very difficult craft, and I have to spend a lot of time doing it well. And eventually I got there, but it really took an enormous amount of work for such a short little diamond to get properly polished.
Interesting. Craig, I know you wrote a lot under, like you said, horror, right? Or so when you wrote a memoir, was that?
Yeah, I think it. I've always liked to try and think of myself as a bit of a Swiss Army knife in terms of like I can do different things, but the truth is I can't. Very few of us can. I've tried to write a children's book too. I've tried to write a detective book. I've tried to write all sorts of stuff, and I think I did best at horror because I truly grew up loving it. And it's not that I haven't read a ton of kids' books or detective fiction, but maybe for me personally, like I just didn't put in the time enough, maybe, or something like that. I'm not quite sure what, or maybe you stretch yourself too thin. So I guess the main point is each, genre or, has its own sort of tokens and abilities that you're going to need to sort of grasp.
Right.
And yeah, you can't be a day tripper and just sort of wander into it and think that you're going to crush it. Because I'm here to tell you that, personally speaking, it doesn't work that way for me anyways.
Writing the script for a graphic novel was a challenge, but it was a challenge of constraints because with a novel, there's a lot of interiority. That means there's a lot of capacity for your character to think and feel a lot. And in a graphic novel, if you want the story to be conveyed in pictures, then there's a lot of action. And the dialogue is much shorter, and you can't have a lot of interiority because otherwise it would just be back to a novel again. Mm-hmm. So it was I like to hop genres because it sets up a different set of writerly challenges to kind of work in a different kind of form. So each new project feels like a way to learn by doing. I like to learn by doing. And so, my feeling is, well, why not give it a try? It doesn't mean it's going to be great the first time around, but it's creatively challenging and creatively engaging to embark on something that's a new form. So, and again, I think Craig said something about wanting projects to be fun. And I think it's that sense of, trying a new thing, learning something, and experimenting with it. Creativity is fun unless you have writer's block, but that's not what this panel's about today. So.
Well, our time is actually up, and I loved that conversation. I loved hearing from all of you. So thank you, Craig and Dorothy and Hiromi. That was awesome. I learned a lot in researching for this, and I think that it was nice to hear your kind of take on it as professionals. So thank you again to everyone that tuned in today, and thank you to you three for a wonderful panel.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, everybody.